and he stood up at this conference and waited.
Guest in this edition of What the Paper Says, Godfrey Boyle, the editor of Undercurrents. I think the programme's going to follow a slightly different format from normal in that Godfrey's not going to talk directly anyway about all the magazines he reads each week, but going to tell us something about Undercurrents, which is now described as the magazine of radical science and people's technology. It had a different description when it began in 1972, so they've been running for nearly 4 years now. I think, can you tell us sort of how it started and what your objectives were and how you set the whole thing up in the beginning?
Well, it started, I suppose, with the days when I was at college. As my accent might betray, from Ireland, and I was at college in Belfast, thankfully before the trouble started. And we used to run a small scientific magazine, that is, I and a group of students in college, in which we tried to explore some of the more radical aspects of science and technology that seemed to be ignored by the ordinary scientific press. But we never really, due to the environment we were in, the restrictions of it being a university magazine and so on, never really got a chance to do precisely what some of us had liked. And when I and a few other people left university, the magazine that we were involved with folded, mainly because we weren't there to run it. And at one stage it was proposed that the magazine be revived, and I was willing to help with the revival with a friend of mine who was still at university. And I began to think about it, and the more I thought about it, the more I began to think that there was room for a much wider magazine, not simply dealing with one particular university, but if you like, an alternative or underground science magazine. At that time, the word alternative was a very vogue word, and everything was alternative. People were starting to talk about alternative medicine and alternative computers and alternative societies and so on, in a way that people have done since, I suppose, 1968. And for the full year of 1971, I suppose it was about the beginning of 71 that the idea started to germinate in my mind. And the person with whom I was going to collaborate on the project was also agreed, even though he was still at university, that it was a better idea to try and launch something completely new. And we experimented with all sorts of ideas. At one stage it was going to be called Free Scientist. I think that was one of the rather less fortunate titles that we rejected. And I started scouting around and trying to meet people just in my spare time. At the time I was working with IPC.
You'd already moved?
Yes, I was in London. Well, in fact, I was at first in Guildford in Surrey working in the specialised science and technology press, which they've got there. But then after a few months I moved to London, and I was living in London when Undercurrents started. But I went to the second arts lab, not the one in Drury Lane, but the one that was in Rupert Street, and met a few people there. I also started just generally making contacts and getting material together, but we really didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know half of the people that we now know were at the same time involved in the area. The clincher, though, that actually got the thing going and provided us with the equivalent of money to start it was that we met an amazing lady called Anne Ward, who lives in Peckham in South London, and who is a Labour Party stalwart who had the great fortune to inherit a sort of reasonable amount of money some years ago. And she has this free press, which still is available, although in slightly different terms. And she basically lets people use it simply for the cost of the electricity and the ink, and you supply your own paper and you can do your own typesetting, and she's got a plate making machine and quite a sophisticated web offset litho system. So that enabled us to produce the first issue of Undercurrents for, I think, less than £100 for 1,000 copies. We also we produced the magazine in a rather unusual format to begin with.
Yeah.
That's
We
something
put
we'd
one
like
here.
to show
It
people.
originally came in a plastic bag, which changed into a paper bag,
That's
and
right,
then
and then changed back to a plastic one again.
Right.
Well, you see, we reckoned that the plastic bag was acceptable because it was a resealable plastic bag. It was meant to be reused, you see, but we attracted a lot of flack from what people whom we regarded as slightly naive environmentalists. So we experimented with using cellophane, which is made from renewable resources, but it was pretty useless, so we went back to plastic again. But then after that, after the fourth issue, we decided we would abandon the bag format, because although it was an attractive idea, a lot of people thought it was an attractive idea, and the idea behind it was that people could print material themselves on their own presses, their own duplicators, and include it, send it to us, 1,000 copies, we'd stick it in the bag, and there wouldn't be any kind of censorship. We would have what's known in the communication business as a common carrier, you see, that was the idea. But that didn't really work out, because most people weren't terribly keen to pay for the cost of printing their own material, which in retrospect isn't all that surprising. And we also found that bookshops weren't very keen to stock it, because people couldn't leaf through it on the shelves, and they would rip open the contents and leave them scattered around and so on. So it was a very great barrier to sales. And anyway, the magazine got launched mainly because we were able to print it very cheaply on Alan Ward's press, and the first issue came out in January or February, I forget which, of 1972. And by an amazing coincidence, on January or February of 72, Peter Harper, who now is one of the most stalwart contributors to the magazine, who's also perhaps the best-known guru of the alternative technology movement, he was organising a conference at University College London, together with Andrew McKillop, who also is pretty well known for a low-impact technology field, into an exploration of alternative technology. So Undercurrents couldn't have come out at a better time, even though we didn't in fact know Andrew McKillop or Peter Harper. But as soon as we got Undercurrents sort of out, then people started contacting us and coming along and saying, look, I've been into all this too, and look, we sort of lit a beacon, if you like, and people came to us. And we realised how incredibly naive the whole thing had been up to then, because we hadn't in any way sort of even scraped the top of the surface of what was going on. But
you'd been trained as a scientist.
Yeah, well, as an
of some
engineer,
sort, yes,
engineer.
and then you were working
as a
journalist.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
yeah.
And
I was
together with a group of friends, you really got the thing.
Well, in fact, the group of friends that we had,
the first number.
That's right. But the group of friends who I worked with on the first number were in many ways not terribly much into what's now known as AT themselves. They were. A lot of them were just friends of mine. One was an old girlfriend of mine. She was quite sort of very helpful at the start, but she wasn't terribly interested in the subject. But then as soon as we got the magazine out, then all the people who were really intrinsically interested in the subject came along and started to get involved. And from then, things happened pretty rapidly. We got the next issue out. At that stage, it was a quarterly, although even then we didn't manage to keep to a quarterly schedule very well. We got a next issue out just in time for the Stockholm Conference on the Environment in June 72, and we took 1,000 copies over to Stockholm in a somewhat farcical trip by ship and car across Sweden and things. But we had a kind of very freaky time at Stockholm and got rid of 500 or 600 of the copies, and met all sorts of other people and rode around in white bicycles and had a nice time. But by that stage it seemed obvious that there was considerable market and a considerable interest in this whole field, and also the environmental crisis was starting to get talked about very avidly, and we reckoned we had some solutions that hadn't been talked about by other people. And the magazine sort of proceeded from there.
In a sense, the argument about the plastic bag reflects some of the arguments that have gone on about the magazine as a whole. I mean, it has had a number of very kind of lunatic fringe approaches to alternative technology. I mean, maybe in those sort of heady first days, that's how everybody felt about it. I mean, the things that I've found particularly interesting are Peter Harper's recent rethink, critical rethink of the whole position. And I imagine that the magazine as a whole now has lost that sort of heady, slightly naive enthusiasm, and is now looking for something else. So, I mean, you've produced all kinds of issues. You've stirred up a fair amount of trouble at one stage or another, haven't you?
Well, I hope so. I'm not quite sure.
Particularly your People's A-bomb.
Oh yes, that. Yes, well, it was curious how that happened. we came in contact with the guy who wrote that article, whose name is Pat Coyne, and it's not a pseudonym, by the way. He does exist. The Sunday Times seemed to think it was a pseudonym, but it's not. He was the person who printed the first issue on Anne Ward's printing machine, because he happened to be running a local community paper, and he was around, and he helped us out. And he said, well, look, I've been thinking about these atom bombs, and really it's very simple to make one. He'd been studying nuclear physics at the time, and he wrote us this piece titled "Towards a People's Bomb," a deliberate sort of parody of the straight scientific article, and it was written in a very provocative way. And at first, it didn't cause any stir at all. It was greeted with hysterical apathy, as they say. But then suddenly, a certain Professor Rotblat, who is a professor of nuclear physics, I think it is somewhere, stood up at a conference organised by the Pugwash Society, who are the World Disarmament Scientist Group, and he stood up at this conference and waved this magazine around and said, look, here are the people planning to build A-bombs in London. This is the danger that we face. And this got front page treatment in the Evening Standard, and a group called Undercurrents published this thing in London. It made it sound out to be some kind of offshoot of the PLO or something. And we were subjected to quite a lot of, not unwelcome attention, because, as they say, there's no such thing as bad publicity. But then the Sunday Times also followed it up a little bit, and apparently it was picked up in America, although we didn't see exactly what happened. But I think that this controversy over how easy it is to make an atomic bomb is recently revived in the papers and the media. But we had got onto it a long time before other people seem to have done, and that was one of the things that we stirred up trouble about. I suppose another one would have been, I suppose we did an investigation into this possibility that an aircraft had been shot down by a missile. That was another of our little, not exactly scoops, but our ventures into the area of straight science and skullduggery of various kinds. I mean, we see the role of Undercurrents mainly as positive, in that we're trying to propose definite technical and scientific possibilities for an alternative society. But on the other hand, we feel that when occasionally some bit of scandal about straight society or straight science happens to fall into our lap, we might as well try to do our little bit to undermine the credibility of the straight system as well. And that's why we've occasionally forayed into these fields.
Is there any kind of common political position that you all hold?
It's difficult to say. There is quite a wide spectrum of views represented on the group of people who produce the magazine. I mean, I'm the full-time paid editor of it, only because, I suppose I started it, and the others, there isn't enough money to pay anybody else, and it was generally recommended.
You now do it full-time?
I do it actually full-time, yes. It's perhaps I'll talk about the money in a minute, but the group ranges, I suppose. There are some people of what could best be called liberal philosophy, people who aren't terribly bothered about the politics, interested in the technology, interested in the possibilities for decentralizing power and so on, and who've got a kind of environmentalist's concern with pollution and with the alienation at work and so on, but not much more than that. And then that ranges right to the perhaps hard left even, and we have one representative of the fairly hard left who comes to meetings very regularly and who tries to inject a note of Stalinism here and there, which doesn't go down very well.
But it's not a kind of dogmatic political position that holds you together as a group?
No, it doesn't really. I often wonder what it is that holds us together. I suppose there is a certain streak of anarchism throughout the lot of it, I suppose, or libertarian socialism, if you like. I wouldn't say there's anybody in the magazine who has a wholeheartedly capitalist approach. We don't have any Bow Group members or anyone like that.
How do you feel about, over the period that you've been doing this, there obviously have been changes in what really is possible with alternative technology, as you called it in the first issue. What do you think of as a sort of sane position at the moment? What sort of future for
considerable future? I still think that the basic philosophies and ideas were correct, and that so-called alternative technologies, i.e., to try and summarize it, small-scale technologies which enable people to take control of their own supplies of food and energy and clothing and shelter and communications and transport and so on, They are practical. They're not quite as easy to achieve as we had in the heady early days thought. You know, the idea was that all you did was connect up a sort of bit of wood onto the end of a car dynamo and you had a windmill. And nowadays we realise that, of course, that if you try to do that, for a start, the thing won't go around fast enough and your car dynamo isn't working at the right speed, and you need a safety mechanism or else it'll fly off and cut somebody's head off. Or if you have a methane digester, it's not just simply a question of putting a sort of load of shit in an oil drum, that you have got to have the thing at the right temperature, and you must make sure that the pH is right, and you've got to have the thing so that it can be continuously fed and so on. But the nice thing and the encouraging thing is that people are steadily, despite gross lack of money, developing a lot of very viable alternatives. Like I just heard the other day that there's a guy down in Sussex who has finally produced what is admittedly a commercial product, but it's a fully working, fairly large-scale methane digester that will work in this country, and it's very well engineered and thoroughly thought out.
So, I mean, in a sense, there's sort of rather more considered technology and rather less of a total obsession with the alternative. You know?
Yes, that's true. I mean, we've had to.
At the beginning, it sounded as if really, you could knit your own.
Yes,
right
almost right. And of course, Peter Harper has injected a very welcome note of realism into it as well, in that he's said that even if you can build these small-scale windmills, they've got the materials have got to be got from somewhere. The actual steel has to be made in the steel works, and the wood has got to be chopped down by lumberjacks and processed and so on. And we've conceded that, and we've sort of tried to integrate the initial idea of small-scale do-it-yourself technology with the idea of radical social change in the factories, in the workplaces, in the cities, so that people, although they would hopefully, I mean, well, one would have to have people still making steel, that it would be made on perhaps a community scale, regional scale, by in relatively ecologically sound processes that, and with recycling and so on and so on and so on. So we're developing, I think, a much broader and more valid critique of society as a whole. But I still think that the alternative technologies are viable.
Right. And the initial issues were, I mean, I was going to say a rag bag, it's sort of unfair, they weren't rag bag, a plastic bag of all sorts of things. I mean, you had things like film reviews and other bits of poetry and so on. I mean, a lot of that really has disappeared,
yes, it has,
isn't it?
That's true.
It's a much harder, tougher magazine now.
Yes.
How have you managed to sustain the thing financially?
Well,
you're not sure either.
That's a miracle. We move in mysterious ways, our wonders to perform. At first, at the very beginning, we started off on about, I think about 8 of us contributing a £5 each. And we got the paper on credit, and we didn't have to pay for that. So that was absurdly low. But on the other hand, we didn't have any costs. We had no overheads, we had no salaries to pay. So after number 5. Number 5 was the first issue in ordinary A4 magazine format. After that, we decided that it was possible to launch the thing as a fully fledged operation with a half-time editor. At that stage, I was only going to be working on the thing half-time. I was getting a bit fed up with my job in IPC. I was working on this paper called Electronics Weekly and writing, as you know, about communications and sort of telephones and things, which was interesting enough, but wasn't really what I wanted to do. And I thought, if I don't give this a try now, I'll never do it. So, possibly rashly, I gave up my job. We raised still an absurdly small sum of, I think, £440 at the first inaugural meeting of the company that we formed called Undercurrents Limited. Now that is, the company is, it's a non-profit democratic company in that everyone has an equal, the votes, the say which you have in the company isn't determined by your shareholding, but only by by the one vote. You've got one vote, right, irrespective of whether you cough up £1,000 or £1. And we launched the magazine, or relaunched, if you like, in sort of February, March of '73, with me as half-time editor. I was also working at Time Out as well, doing occasional pieces for them and various other bits of freelance work. And I suppose if we hadn't, about 3 months after that, had a further injection of cash by being asked by Wildwood House to do a big book called The Book of Radical Technology, at least that's the tentative title of it, it still hasn't been decided, we probably would be in serious financial trouble now, because, or else we would have had to seriously raise the £2,000 of capital that we reckoned we really would have needed. We did these various complicated cash flow graphs, and we showed that the shortfall between income and expenditure would be such and such, given certain reasonable assumptions of growth. And in fact, strangely enough, that the situation has worked out roughly in some ways as we anticipated, and that we would have needed the money. But the money was provided by Wildwood House and by Pantheon Books in America, and we've got a contract with them to do this big book, about 250 A4 pages, about what called radical technology, and it's all about AT. It's about food and energy and shelter and transport and communications and also the philosophy that moves towards decentralized alternative society.
Because I mean that preoccupation seems to run through the magazine. It's not only about the technology,
absolutely
about the
not.
way
And we
in which
try to keep
society might be organised.
That's exactly, and it would be very naive of us to keep on about the technology without saying anything about that. I think we must not fall into the trap of getting hung up on the technology. But anyway, we got £1,000 from Wildwood House as an advance on the UK rights of the book, and we got, well, the total was about sort of £1,500 from America, no, a bit more than that, 1,700, of which we've had about 1,000 so far in various dribs and drabs. And unfortunately, we still owe the people who have written a lot of the stuff on the book. We owe several £100 to them, and we're just wondering at the moment how the hell we're going to pay a lot of them. But what's happened is that the magazine has grown slowly from circulation in February, March of '73. It had subscriptions were about 500. We had about 500 subscribers. We were printing about 3,000 copies of number 5. With number 6, we printed 6,000 copies of number 6. We at that stage also got Moore Harness, who distribute Private Eye and Time Out, to take an interest in the magazine.
Because until then you were humping around
the cells, exactly.
Yes.
Well, now, the absurd thing about it is that Moore Harness really are very inefficient and are not satisfactory at all. We had hoped that when they took it over that we wouldn't have to do any humping around the bookshops, that they would service all the bookshops and they would do it properly. But in fact, they're very inefficient. I mean, at the first issue they gave 10 copies to Compendium. We were already selling 50 in Compendium, we're now selling 200. I mean, and so effectively what we've done is we've practically duplicated Moore Harness ourselves, and it's very lucky really, because if we'd been depending on Moore Harness, we'd have been bankrupt a long time ago. They take a lot of copies from you, sort of for us it's a lot, sort of 2,500, 3,000 copies, but they return nearly 1,500 to 2,000 of them, or 1,500 anyway. A lot of the returns in rotten, tatty condition. They take 55% of the cover price, and they don't pay you for at least 3 months. In fact, we've now been waiting 6 months for payment on number 8 Undercurrents. We still haven't got it yet. So, as you can see, if we'd been depending on them, we would have been bankrupt.
It's surprising, really, that there isn't some alternative distribution network for all these publications.
Well, I mean, the people, ever since I've got involved in Undercurrents and in underground magazines generally, people have been saying, why doesn't somebody get together an alternative distribution network? And I still don't know why. I mean, it would seem to be viable. I can't quite understand why it isn't. We would even, if we hadn't got ourselves so involved in Undercurrents itself, I think that we could probably even set one up ourselves, because we have effectively evolved something like that for our own purposes. We've got 100 bookshops in the UK to which we regularly send magazines by post. We either distribute them around London by car, or we take them by post, or send them by post. We've got a few outlets overseas which we're trying to expand as well. We've also now very recently negotiated sort of air freighting arrangements, so we can send copies to America by air freight, and then they can be posted from New York quickly to places in America, and that gets around a lot of the costs of air mail.
Are you distributing it anywhere else outside England?
Well, we've got one place in Holland, a place in Holland, a place in Sweden, a couple of places in France, but nowhere in Germany for some weird reason. That's about it, really, I think. Oh, Australia, we've got Australia, quite a few people in Australia, Canada. But it's only an odd dozen copies, 20 copies. France is quite good, got 100 copies a time go there. Sweden also is very good. There's a lot of interest in Sweden. In fact, we've got links with the Swedish group, which is producing a magazine or a book about the low energy society, and they want us to sell that over here. So we're starting to establish quite firm, close links with other groups on the continent.
Right, so I mean you're busy working on this book at the moment, that's your sort of main activity other than
well, in fact the book is almost finished. The trouble is that getting the last little few bits of it finished are taking ages and ages, and the usual thing, just 85% of it was fairly easy, but the last 15% is taking an awfully long time. But the magazine itself, just to summarise the situation, is not actually making a profit yet. We reckon we need a cash flow from subscriptions and bookshops and so on of something like 200 or a bit more pounds a week something like that. In fact, we're only getting 180 or so a week, roughly, and therefore the book is still subsidising it. Now, we've applied for a loan from an outfit called ICOF, which Industrial Common Ownership Finance, which lends money to cooperatives, and we're hoping that they will give us some money to really prime the pump and start doing things properly. And we've been scrimping and saving and not doing things right and not advertising properly and not being able to send stuff out for weeks after it should have been sent out because we haven't got enough people to do it. And hopefully we can start doing things properly, and hopefully then, having got so close to a break-even circulation, I mean, we need 7,500 copies per issue to sell. We're selling 6,500, so we're so close that we ought to get there fairly easily once we can get the thing running.
Right. I mean, I said at the beginning that you weren't going to talk about, what you read each week. Obviously, from looking at the magazine, you do comb an enormous amount of information. I mean, can you say a little about where you get the kinds of information that you publish from?
Let's see. I suppose from the science field, one of the main things that we do read each week, if only to find out what they're up to, is New Scientist. If you like, New Scientist is the nearest equivalent in the straight publishing scene to Undercurrents. AD is another thing that we obviously look at pretty frequently. We read quite a few American publications. There's a magazine called Alternative Sources of Energy. Occasionally we read Mother Earth News, but it's a bit kind of folksy and rather too... In a way, it's an example of what we didn't want to do. But I suppose we all read The Guardian, the Financial... some of us get Financial Times at work. I don't actually get it, but Financial Times can be quite useful for giving background information to various things. Another thing that we do quite frequently read is People's News Service. They have a very quite good alternative news service coming out it's actually every fortnight now. I think they're struggling. They may not last much longer, but we subscribe to that and we find that quite useful. What else do we get? I find it very hard to think of them all. This magazine called The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in America, which has got quite a lot of good information. There's another very intriguing new newsletter which has started in the States called The Elements, and it comes out monthly. It costs about $5 a year for sort of 16 pages, and it's all about natural resources and how the various big companies are buying up aluminium and food and so on, and what the oil companies are up to, and generally it keeps pretty clever and pretty close tabs on what the straight world is up to, and it also exposes alternatives as well. It's edited by a man called James Ridgway, who's written a lot of books about politics of ecology and about depletion of natural resources and so on. So we read that quite a lot. Ramparts is another magazine from the States that I read very regularly, and I think it's very good.
Do you ever find yourselves consulted by what you call the straight world?
Occasionally, yes. We get we get the BBC ringing up, as everybody does, I suppose, asking silly questions. I'm expecting you to sort of drop everything to do their research for them. We get that. We get Granada, I suppose, the straight media. They were supposed to be doing something about self-sufficiency. And Andrew Coburn, who I think was doing had something to do with it, was in close contact with us at one stage, but I don't know what's happened about that project. We get rung up by, occasionally people like The Observer or the Sunday Times would ring up. But we don't have all that much contact with the other straight newspapers, like The Guardian. In a way, we've got a lot of sympathy with Anthony Tucker, who writes in The Guardian, because he writes some pretty good stuff. But for some reason, we've sent him copies of Undercurrents, and he hasn't really ever expressed any great interest in it, so we haven't really bothered to follow that up at all. Other parts of the straight press, we have got quite cordial relations with AD. And funnily enough, now with The Ecologist. The Ecologist is a magazine that we've kind of been a bit wary of. We're not terribly keen on their political line, or the lack of it. But on the other hand, recently they've sort of expressed interest in getting together with us, and so we're going to be getting in touch with them to do, possibly just to exchange adverts, for instance, but that's all.
You haven't, as a group, got involved in any communal experiments or an attempt to build yourself, which some of the groups
haven't really, no. Not as a group. I mean, I myself have recently moved to live in the country, but that's just as an individual, although there are a few friends of like mind who live near me, and there's a guy called Ian Hogan, who you might have heard of, who comes here quite a lot. He runs an outfit called Low Impact Design, and he's been doing the product reviews pages in Undercurrents and showing people from a much more together point of view how they can really get harnessing solar energy and wind power and so on. And we're hoping that we are starting to bring AT into a much more practical, thorough phase than it was in before.
So, and that's what you see as a sort of future direction for Undercurrents?
I think that's one of our future directions. Yes, I think that we will definitely try to cover the world, the fast developing alternative technology techniques as thoroughly as we can, and to, if for no other reason than to stop them or to try and give them a critical analysis from a radical point of view. So we're not terribly keen, for instance, to see Plessy starting to turn out solar cells, or we want to try and, by our presence, affect the way that AT evolves. And I suppose to some extent we've been partially successful in making sure that AT isn't totally co-opted. I mean, to a very great extent, it already has become co-opted by straight industry. Adverts in the Sunday Times for solar collectors. It's alternative technology for existing society.
What ways do you object to that?
Well, we object to it, I suppose, when you see phenomena like the Tomorrow's World Alternative Technology Exhibition. Right. Because Tomorrow's World succeeded in presenting alternative technology as just another way of providing these services for existing society, rather than a way of using the characteristics of renewable energy sources and small-scale technologies to give people more freedom and more independence and more control over their lives. Tomorrow's World was perpetuating its usual obsession with gadgets. It was saying, here is another wonderful alternative gadget that you can get off the shelf for so many pounds, and with it, you can then sort of become, or save money and not even necessarily become more independent. And we feel that this is sort of prostitution of what we've regarded as AT.
Because that involves some implicit sort of social change.
We would say that it does. I mean, we would like to think that it does. But I suppose it's only because I suppose we were first to use the term that we feel some sort of proprietary control over it. But I mean, from a purely semantic point of view, there's no reason why the other things shouldn't be called alternative technology, just as I suppose fusion power is alternative technology as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for coming to talk about it.
All right.